As a geographer, I love maps. And here we are, we're looking at a map drawn in the 1640s, but really published a little later in 1654. This is taken from the very first atlas of Scotland. In the 1650s, Scotland was the best mapped country in the world. And this particular map of the Sheriffdom of Fife, and we're seeing a detail taking us from Lochore right down to Lochore, it was really drawn by a man called James Gordon, who was updating the work of an earlier surveyor called Timothy Pont. And this is probably the best of all of the Blauw Dutch maps that were produced in this volume, Atlas Novus, in 1654. But what does it tell us about Lochore? It shows a loch, for example, that is a rather different shape to the loch we see today. But it has the name here written as Loch O-R-R, Lochore, and we have Inch of Gaul, or Gaul. So there's the name of an island, Inch Gaelic, the island of Gaul. And what is that? That is a word that tells us in Gaelic that there were foreigners here. So it's the island of the foreigners. But we distinctly have two. We have a loch name, which comes down to us to the present as Lochore, and we have an island name, which still exists, but the two often get intermingled and can be a little confusing, but still important. Here is a map from the middle of the 19th century showing the survival of the Inchgall element of the names we've just looked at, Inchgall Mill. And this is essentially still here. So the name does survive. You can see it as a place in the landscape. But it was a name that had a much wider currency in association with the castle here and the old barony of Inchgall. This is a map that was put together by Edward Henderson, who wrote probably the most detailed study of what he called Lochore Shire. Lochore Shire essentially covering the two parishes of Ballingry in the west and Ochterderrin in the east. So it's a shire within a shire, and of course to the north of us we have the Bishopshire, a religious church barony in Kinrossshire. But he introduces elements from the Blauw Atlas that we've just seen a sample of, and he gives us some additional names. But he essentially is pointing us right here to Lochore Castle, site of. What's all that about? Isn't Lochore Castle this place on the island? Well, we see this is called Inchgall, but we think that the original caput of the barony was actually round the loch at this site here. And that is, when we see early references to Lochore Castle, that is what we're actually talking about. And the building that we're trying to conserve comes a little using an Organised survey map from the middle of the last century. We see a farm called Chapel Farm, site of the chapel of Inchgall. So there's something been going on here, and wouldn't it be great to be able to go and dig there, but sadly the site has been largely destroyed, as we'll see in a second. But Edward Henderson started to draw the various phases of development of that site, occupied from the 12th century. A motte hill, Motte and Bailey Castle with two distinct phases. And Oliver will probably say more about that. So one of the first characters we encounter in history who lived in this place was a man called Robert. Robert the Burgundian, which tells us he was one of the early Normans who came to this country. And he acquired a charter from King David I in 1124, which gave him essentially the barony of Lochoreshire. That includes both east and west. He is obviously a man on the up and up, a man on the make. He is perhaps not regarded terribly highly in some quarters. He's trying to nick land from the neighbouring monks on St. Serph's Island, the Chaldees of St. Serph's Island. And that is getting him into trouble with the authorities. And here we see an element from a dispute which is relating to Kirkness. He was translated into different languages. And it gives us some wonderful place names, including the famous Gruach's Well, which is the source of the Lochte burn. And here is Gruach's Well, with a number of distinguished historians, including Professor Ranald Cant from St Andrews University, Simon Taylor, the distinguished place name expert, and other geographers and historians. The only place in Scotland named after Macbeth's wife. So, Robert the Burgundian, he tries to fit in as best he can. In fact, he marries locally, and it's his son Constantine who continues the line onwards. And we get several centuries of continuity. Styled themselves of Lochore, Constantine of Lochore. And that continues right up till 1294, when Sir David of Lochore, the Lochores in 1295, Sir David left 2 daughters, and one of them married a Weems and inherited the east side of the barony, East Lochoreshire. The other daughter married into another Norman family, a very up-and-coming family, the de Valence family. And here we see the coats of arms of the Valences. One of these was a Chamberlain of Scotland. They were quite a powerful family. And we have here some really good links with the Valences, possibly with Adam de Valence, Adam Valence, that we see the beginnings of the development of the castle that we know today as Lochore Castle, but should really be called Inchgall Castle, because it's in the western part, West Lochoreshire, or the barony of Inchgall. But again, the name changes. In the early 15th century, it's a marriage between Andrew Wardlaw and one of the Valence daughters that keeps the continuity going. And the Wardlaws come from Wilton, but they also have a large house at Torry, a lot of land at Torry, and then they acquire Inchgall. So they become the Wardlaws of Inchgall. So they've still got the western part of the once much larger barony of. But it was during the period of the Wardlaws, their ownership, that we hear descriptions of the castle, Inchgall Castle, being one of the 4 most powerful castles in this part of the country. And this quote dates back to an episode called The Rough Wooing, when King Henry VIII was trying to marry off his son to Mary. The survival of the Wardlaws of Torry is quite interesting in the landscape even today. The name still survives. This is an Ordnance Survey map that shows us, again it's from the 1850s, from Rosewell, down here is Torry's Lone. And this was an access that took you out from the settlements here to the common grazings and the peat cuttings beyond in the direction of Kinlassic. There's Hairlock Hill here. This is all before Crosshill, Lochore and Ballingry were developed. But there's a name that survives, and there is a street called Lone Head, and that is the head of this lone, the Torry's Lone, and there's a photograph of the first bit of Torry's Lone. So that takes us back, that's a reminder of the period of the Wardlaws, when the castle was recognised as a very powerful place, and there was probably a lot of additions and amendments made to the structure of the castle. So then the line comes to an end. All of these families who have intermarried with each other and kept the castle powerful. And times have changed in that castles have really become almost out of date. Fortified castles were not the fashion anymore. In the 1630s, the last of the Wardlaws, it's kind of sad, the last of them was a young boy, and he really couldn't afford to keep the place, and the estate was sold to the Earl of Rothes, who kept it for a very short period. And then in the 1650s, the estate of Inchgall, the barony of Inchgall, was acquired by Sir John Malcolm, who came from a place called Balbiddy, which is not a million miles from here in Fife. So he also becomes Malcolm of Lochore. And so we have a century of the Malcolms in this part of the world. And what they do is they move their residence. the castle by then, Inchbald Castle, is not a place he wants to live. And he builds himself a house with a great prospect, a wonderful view further up the hill. This is initially called Inchbald House, but he has acquired, and the charter says it, he is laird of the barony of Inchbald, but for some reason he doesn't seem to like the name, and he changes all of this. He is Malcolm of Lochore. His house, the name is changed to Lochore House. The estate is called Lochore Estate. And that's really how we recognise things today. This is from a plan drawn by an Edinburgh land surveyor called William Crawford in 1811. He was asked to do a plan of the estate of Lochore. Here's the house up here, as it looked then, and here's the walled garden, the stables, parklands. So we have all the elements of a totally new style of landscape where great landowners. Detail of the house, which sadly had a fire and was eventually demolished in the 1990s. It had been occupied really up till the 1860s by a variety of landowners, and there are still elements today. Like the castle, this designed landscape has seen better days, but there are still elements you can explore. So the castle is essentially abandoned by the late 17th century. Very similar to Lochleven Castle to the north of us, near Kinross. But if we want to know what that castle looked like, there are a number of images that we can draw on. Here is one of the castle in Lochore, as it's described, drawn in 1770 by a man called John Clark of Eldon. And he was a very distinguished man and an artist. He was related to the Adams, the architect's family at Blair Adam, and often used to go and stay there. So he must have come along one day and sketched Lochore Castle. But if you look at this image, which is in the archive of Glasgow University, you'll see it appears to be the wrong way round. Someone's made a negative of this and printed it the wrong way round. So we have to turn it round to see what it actually looked like when he sketched it. And this really begins to give you an idea of how powerful a place, what a strong building this is, with its great tower and its barbican, smaller towers around the end. And there's the entrance on the west side. But not only that, it's standing on its castle has been abandoned for at least a century, but still seems to be quite a lot of it there. And there's another image. You can barely see it. It's like it's in the mist here. This is a sketch done by a military man called Henry Hutton. Henry Hutton, having had a very distinguished military career, took an interest in antiquities and wandered around sketching them. He was up in Scotland Well sketching the old Red Friars Hospice there. And in 1781 he comes to Lochore and does a sketch from the north shore of the castle. And that again is taken for publication, not in its original form. A man called Francis Grose, who produced his own volume on the antiquities of Scotland, just a year or two after Adam of Cardonal. He's an ex-military man who obviously enjoyed the wine and travelling, and he was quite a character. We have to thank this man for getting Robert Burns to write a poem called Alloway Kirk, which he sketched himself in his own volume of antiquities. And of course Alloway Kirk was renamed to Hutton's sketch. And a man called James Sparrow did that to it and gave us this wonderful building from a slightly different angle to the last one, which again shows us what a powerful and strong place it is, situated on its island. And obviously the trees have kind of taken control there. But again, a sublime ruin in the landscape. That must have been stunning to see if you were local. But all of that was to change. And it's interesting that you get these sketches just on the dawn of great change in the landscape. And that great change was brought about by a man called Alexander Park. In 1788, when these books were being published, he buys the Lochore estate and he wants to improve it. We're in the heart of the agricultural revolution, and what he plans to do is to get rid of Lochore completely, drain the loch away. Now that might seem a mad thing to do, but that was the time, that was the period. Anything was possible. And the idea would be to drain and reclaim and cultivate the landscape to make the value of the estate increase. So how would he drain away Lochore? Well, he digs a big cut or a channel, and that's still there. 10 years later, when Crawford came to survey, we see names. There's the loch where it was, part of a loch, but it's actually no longer there, probably filled with reeds. And we see the emergence of fields with meadow names. And that's the origin, of course, of our local name. So he's drained away the loch, and others were to follow. The Grahams up at Loch Leven were to lower Loch Leven just a few years. We come to the Organised survey of the 1850s. We can see still marked at the site of Lochore, formerly Inchgall Loch. So they're still playing with the name Inchgall here, which is quite interesting. And somebody has drawn the old shoreline of the loch on this map. Somebody else has done a reconstruction in this sketch of what it would have looked like after drainage. Now, all of a sudden we see the stonework seems to have been decimated. Compare that with the earlier sketches of Hutton and Clark. There's the cut, the loch being drained away, and what's happening is a lot of the stonework from the Barnacle wall and the building are being taken to line the cut. And I suppose Captain Park was the first vandal to start demolishing the castle. And there may have been a few locals as well, subsequently, who found it a very useful quarry for stone. A later person to sketch the castle were a couple of lawyers and architects, McGibbon and Ross, in their famous work on the castellated and domestic architecture of Scotland in 1889. And so we can see how much is left a century after the Clark and Hutton sketches. It's beginning to look a little bit sadder. And then all of a sudden, the loch comes back again. In the early 20th century, with the development of deep mining, the two Mary pits and all the other pits in the area, you get subsidence and the loch suddenly starts to reappear again. And so we end up with a renewed Lochore. This is it from the air, looking towards Gosshill and Lochore from the west. And with the development of the country park, that now becomes a feature again. But sadly, the castle is ignored. The castle is not restored to its original island. So it makes it much more interesting to actually go and explore the building now and its immediate surroundings to find out how big the island was and so on. So here we are with something that we're now left with, that we have to cope with and understand and look after, because it is such a special place. Things have been found there, and I'd love to know where this is. This is a dagger blade that was discovered and is featured in Eddie Henderson's book. So if any of you know where this or any other of the finds from the castle are located. Eddie Henderson, who was involved with some survey work out at the Chapel Farm site, was also involved with the castle here, Inchgall Castle, alias Lochore Castle, and he produced his classic book in 1988 on the history of Lochoreshire, using the John Clark coloured up image as his front cover. And he spent a lot of time exploring the history of the area, and we're indebted to him for all the work that he did. And it allowed him to make a reconstruction based on the documentary evidence that he had uncovered. And now that we have more detailed ways of exploring landscapes using archaeology, geophysics and so on, we can test what he did, and has he got it right here in terms of the towers, the walls, and the causeway that appear to link the island with the mainland. And he left us, Eddie Henderson, with this statement. The castle had been scheduled in 1933, and in 1939 he did some work on the conservation. He recognised how important this castle was. And he says here, Lochore Castle has somehow escaped total destruction. It can, however, only be a matter of time before this last link with an age that has long since passed will have gone forever, unless steps are taken soon to preserve and protect the little. The little that now remains still stands there and is now part of the focus of the Living Lowlands Landscape Partnership Programme. And that is why we are all here tonight, to celebrate this place. And what we are trying to do in the Living Lowlands Programme is to understand it from a variety of angles, from documentary sources and from archaeology. And then the plan is to conserve it. And that is why we're here trying to raise awareness and raise funds in order that we can embark on the conservation that Eddie Henderson 30 odd years ago was so keen to see pursued, and he did his bit. So it's up to us now to do our bit to keep this wonderful element of the landscape part of the community.